although the climate picture is very, very sobering, there is a possibility still of a better future available to us where we're killing fewer animals, where we are digging less stuff out of the ground and shipping it around the world, where the air is cleaner, where if we do it right, there is cheaper energy for poorer households and all that sort of thing.
Dr. Ben Richards, thank you very much for joining in. We know you're a very busy man, and we really appreciate the fact that you've taken some time. So, without further ado, we have a few questions that we'd really love to hear your thoughts on. And so let's go with the first one. What are the most important current trends in climate change for people to understand that are making a difference for our future?
Yeah. So, are you really asking about what's new in the science compared to what you might have known about a few years ago, or?
I think so, yeah. So obviously we've all seen the news, and it's sort of that more in-depth understanding. I think a lot of us we read about these things and you get that high level view. And so it'd be great to get that next level sort of appreciate
Yes.
what's going on.
Yeah, that's fair. So, if let's say we start with the IPCC, which was published 2 years ago now, the science that's the UN gathering of science, trying to get an impression of what the science is actually saying. And the science, of course, is millions of papers. Actually, it's a huge quorum of material. So the IPCC tries to say, well, what are they definitely saying?
Yeah.
What are outliers? And the cutoff point for any papers to be involved in that process would be nearly 5 years ago now. And so we are dealing with papers then which were prepared on science from 7 or 8 years ago.
Mm.
In that time, an awful lot of science has gone on. So you've got to start off with the idea that the IPCC is fairly conservative. It's only if it's really well supported that it's going to report that. But secondly, the stuff which is ongoing and developing, it won't have been able to capture because it's too recent. So if we start with science, and then I'll look a little bit also observations. So science, which is analysis. Everywhere you look in climate science, people are finding that where we knew there would be a range of possible outcomes from a particular level of warming, and we hoped to goodness, but it would be on the lower end of impact. And we keep finding it's actually more likely on the higher end of impact. And we're definitely finding in terms of what we're observing of, let's say, sea surface temperatures or intensity of rainfall or periods of fire weather, like in, let's say, Canada last year. But we seem to find that it's a certain level of warming, and we're on about 1.3 degrees above pre-industrial levels now. A certain level of warming seems to give us more intense impacts than we had hoped.
Got it.
There's a sad thing about climate science that we tend to only report. I haven't written a paper, but I'm not in an academic position now. I'm not paid by a university now, but I've a PhD from University of London. That's paleoclimate. I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But if you publish, you have to be very, very able to defend what you're publishing to the nth degree, which is good. That science is generally conservative. But then if you actually have a conversation with a climate scientist, they say, yeah, actually, this is really, really scary, because if it becomes at the far end of what we know is possible, rather than the middle, which is easy to publish, or the very conservative sort of not too bad, which is also easy to publish, then we will be in trouble. And an awful lot of the impacts that we're now finding are on this is as bad as we sort of dreaded. So it is within what we predicted, but it's not really in what was well publicized, except, of course, by scaremongering kind of, you always get some headlines which are very scaremongering. And really, for those of us in the science, it's really frustrating. You wish that they didn't say that, because then the general public says, oh, you're crying wolf. There's a publication that says, that the Atlantic overturning might stop within a couple of decades, which it's still possible it just might, but the evidence of that is pretty thin. It's more likely to be many, many decades. Then the headlines say, we might have minus 10 degrees on average in the UK within 10 years. Well, that's not really what the paper said. And it doesn't help the general public perceive what the relative actual threats are. So to try and summarize, wherever we're looking, the impacts are a little bit worse or on the worse end of what we had predicted. It's within what we knew would have been possible, but it's as if it's kind of earlier than we'd hoped it would happen. We thought we might have a few more decades.
Yeah.
And you may have seen some of the fairly extraordinary events of last year. For example, the North Atlantic sea surface temperature was way off, far higher than anything we've had before. It was like 2 degrees warmer throughout most of the summer. It's still warmer than any record we've had before. That's one reason. That will have helped drive the recent storms in the UK, because warmer sea surface gives you more evaporation, gives you more energy in your system. The winds have to be stronger because they're redistributing the energy. So that's one reason why there's a bit more storminess, although the Met Office is very clear to say, but actually there isn't a really clear signal that we have more stormy weather, because storms vary so much by year anyway. But the basic science is simple, that warmer air holds more moisture, therefore you can have more in the clouds and more as heavy downpours. And that is clear in the data, but we have more heavy downpours in the UK, let's say, than in past. We've got quite long periods of records in the UK. In some of our records, actually the longest continuous records of anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
So we know that that's statistically different. And that's actually, of course, most of our experience as well, that there are more highly intense rainfall events than there used to be. We've designed our systems, our sewers, our drains, our roofs, our downpipes, expecting a certain amount of rain. Well, what used to be very, very rare is now relatively common. And we're also getting some events, which is all what we predicted, by the way, some events, but never would have happened under a previous regime because it just wouldn't have had enough energy in the atmosphere. And now it's able to hold more moisture or faster wind speeds and so on. So we are getting some events which just simply couldn't have happened before. Give you an example. There was a hurricane that hit Acapulco in Mexico in the autumn. I think it was October. And that was a tropical storm until just under 24 hours before it hit the land. And at that point, it very suddenly intensified to a Category 5 hurricane, which is the strongest category that exists at the moment. Nobody had actually managed to predict that this tropical storm was going to intensify so suddenly, and it's because of the warm water that it went over at that time. So there are some events happening which really you couldn't get the maths together, the physics together to produce this very intense event. So hopefully I've given you a bit of flavour there. It isn't great news, is it? But it isn't the very worst.
Yeah. So essentially the sort of side academia, if you like, are to a degree conservative, because to be otherwise would be seen as, as you say, crying wolf, whatever, kind of going a bit too far out there.
I was trying to separate the public reporting by the newspapers, which often is a sort of cry wolf, from the academia, which is quite carefully worded and so on. It's quite interesting, but in the public discourse, particularly in the right wing, there's a general sense that, well, maybe the scientists are over-egging this in order to keep their funding or something like that. It really, honestly, is the opposite. Scientists, almost to a person, almost everybody, is probably sort of toning it down to make sure that it doesn't sound too shocking, which is a shame. It's called self-censorship, but it's the opposite direction to what particularly right-wing commentators would say. And they say, they're just producing what their jobs need them to produce. It's not really that way. If any scientists could show that there were different explanations for the science, for the warming we're seeing, that would be a great thing for their career. That's where the reward is in science, is disproving things, not providing yet more evidence. But unfortunately, we are the ones completely responsible for the warming we're seeing, which is that's an IPCC conclusion. We are completely, the warming we're seeing is completely explained by extra gases in the atmosphere, but we have added, it's got our fingerprints on it. The idea that maybe it might be something else, that's for the birds. That's for people who don't want to engage with the realities of the situation, I'm afraid.
Absolutely. So thanks. So let's move to the next question. So what can people do in their everyday lives to make a positive difference?
Yeah, so it depends completely on people's situation. I now own a house, So I've been able to put a plan in for the next 5 to 10 years to really decarbonize a lot of our house. And fortunately, we've had a grant available as well. We're here in Scotland where the grant system's different to England, but it's allowed us to fit a heat pump, which is if you have the possibility in where you're living to change from gas heating or oil heating to heat pump, that's electric heating, it is incredibly efficient. In the UK grid, it gives you a very, very low carbon because actually around about half of our electricity is produced from non-carbon sources, and that's going up every year. Okay. And as long as it's fitted well, heat pumps are brilliant. Unfortunately, some people get bad installations and they don't work well, but a well-fitted heat pump is brilliant. So that's the number one. The number two also is about gas. If you can move from cooking with gas to an induction stove, so cooking with electricity, but the modern ones, the induction, not the old kind of glowing coils, which are pretty inefficient by comparison. An induction stove, do you know, actually at home here, we haven't bought an induction hob to replace the old electric one. We've bought one that you just plug into the wall, which has got two kind of burners on it. Cost us £30. So that's like our interim, our step. And we're finding the cooking is faster. It does all we need it to do. But of course, this is very, very low impact in terms of carbon. So induction stoves are my number two. And then it's all about, but the next one is going to be about eating. If you can, eat a lot less beef. We haven't gone vegetarian, but we do eat a lot less beef because beef has a very, very high carbon intensity. Even if you have it from the UK or Ireland, which is less intense, definitely, than say getting Argentinian beef or something which is, partly reared on soya from what used to be the Amazon rainforest. Yes, there are worse, there are less bad, but still less beef is good. Chicken and so on is less damaging. You can look this all up on the IPCC page actually, which has a really great graph. But beef is way off. Then it's lamb. Then it's dairy, and then it's chicken, and then you get down to nuts, which of course are carbon positive and they're still a source of protein. But I'm not in the position where my family is going to just eat nuts. No, there are days when we are still going to have to eat spaghetti bolognese. We haven't got to that stage, especially with a teenage family. That's not possible. So I've helped imagine that removing gas is the biggest thing you can do for your life. The second would be eating much less meat. And the third thing would be transport options.
Right.
So wherever you're able to travel in a way that's electrically powered, electric car, electric scooter, electric train, that's vastly better. However, it's not simple. And in many cases, it's quite expensive as a starting point. We've done something funny in our house. We have bought a second-hand electric car. Was about £7,000. These days you could get it for £3,500. The second-hand one does 80 miles. It's only for all our local journeys, but for all of the kids' sports and things like that, it does do what we need. So it's about 10,000 miles in a year we've done, and it's incredibly cheap to run. It's about 2p per mile, and that's because we can charge it very cheaply overnight. I'm never going to drive from Glasgow to England in it, right? It's not going to get me there. But we have a petrol car, I'm afraid, for the distance. But other people have been able to buy the more modern electric cars, which can do the distance. Well, you're looking at over £10,000 even for a second-hand there. And yet the price is much less than it used to be. So keep a watching brief on that if you're able, especially if you do lots of miles. Those are the people who should change first. It will eventually save you money. But it's something definitely to be considering of how you could move from that if you are a car owner.
That's really great. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, in London, I actually cycle mostly where I go to, or take a train. So, and the air quality as well in London is pretty horrendous. So, car driving is a big factor in that.
Although it's remarkably better. I used to live in London, moved about 2 years ago. And since the ULEZ has expanded, it's a lot better than it was. Yeah. And you may be surprised at what the biggest culprit for poor air quality in central London now is actually gas boilers.
Right. Okay.
So it's a cleaner fuel than, say, coal of the old days of the 1950s, but it is not a clean fuel. You are still having incomplete combustion and poisonous gases that you're not supposed to breathe in. That's why they're pumped out of the flue. And in central London, where there's so many such devices, that is the number one cause of poor air quality. Number two is people burning wood in their stoves. I won't go
Yeah.
into that one.
Thanks. That. There's been some really great points there, and I really like the fact that these are, I mean, heat pump, induction hob. You know, the eating. It's the eating. I've heard that many times before, but the heat pump and the induction hub, I haven't heard in that sense. So those are really great. And actually, I know people in Finland who've got heat pumps installed, and they work
Finland has
fantastically.
gone amazingly last 2 years since of course the Ukrainian invasion. I know there's been a great push to get off gas in Finland, and they led the European Union in per capita installation of heat pumps last year. So well done.
All right, let's move on to the next question. So, and this was a personal one. I always like sort of throwing in something subjective that's really just what you think, not the science, not anything like that. So, in your personal view, what aspects of all this, as in climate change, do you think would be helpful to be reflected in the creative arts, or what would you like to see? So, it's like, what kind of stories would be great to see reflected? What perspectives would be helpful to have to kind of get that message into people's hearts about climate change?
I would say anything around the injustice of the fact that it's those who cause it usually suffer the least, but both globally and within a nation. So in this country, poor air quality or so on is mainly in poorer neighborhoods. What's the figure? It's something like 50% of all emissions are from 1 or 2% of the world's population. It's a very small percentage of the world's population. Sorry, the world, yes, who are of course the richest. So there's an injustice angle there. Oxfam has the figures on that if you need to look it up.
Yeah, no, thanks.
And a graphic. Then there's also, I think there's areas of hope. It's a glorious thing, to my mind, to see a street with lots of solar panels on it. And you think, well done, all these householders, or if it's a housing association, whoever, you have seen that this will be a good long-term plan for your people, and it's a sign of hope. Certainly in the summer, solar panels can provide most of what a household needs in the UK. Then, so those sorts of hopeful alternatives.
It's the injustice aspect. You're absolutely right. So
The rule is this is just the shorthand of it. Those that have done the least to cause climate change suffer the first and the worst.
Yeah,
it's horrific, but it's a fact. I was at COP in Dubai, leading a group of young people there before Christmas, and it was so clear that the poorest nations had the least importance in those negotiations, and it's a tragedy. To the extent that when the major announcement was made, it was before the small island nations had managed to get into the room to raise their objections. So the injustice on an international scale is horrific, and the experience of people on the ground, particularly in African countries, I had a chat with some this afternoon, is totally unfair. The rains don't come when they have come for generations. They all knew when to plant their crops, and in the last 10 years, they said, it's always off timing and sometimes doesn't come at all, which really actually means hunger.
Yeah.
It's desperately unfair and absolutely linked to extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, messing up the patterns of the East African monsoon.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Thank you. All right. Next question. So, are there any climate lessons we can take from other parts of the world? I think we're asking this question in particular because the group is mostly based in around London.
Do your own work on that. There will be every single city in the world has some sort of climate plan, and we're all learning from each other. And there's actually a network of city mayors internationally that do things sort of in COPs and so on. So actually, London is leading in some areas fantastically, and then trailing a long way in other areas. So you may have friends in other parts of the world. I heard that Vancouver has a great plan for retrofitting buildings to lose less heat, to insulate them better. And they've got, I think it's a 20 or maybe a 30-year plan with lots of training of tradesmen and so on of how to actually install better insulation to really reduce the amount of fuel poverty. So there are things going on in so many different countries, and we can learn. One thing we could also learn actually is around flood resilience. So surface flooding in London is now a problem. It wasn't 30 years ago. And but there's various aspects to that, but one is the intense rainfall. And there
Yeah.
are things you can do if you're at the bottom of a hill rather than the top of a hill to protect your property. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Next one's a pretty big one. What are some of the future changes or trends in society that you foresee from climate change, if any? So it's really looking into, what's going on right now. If this continues, I know this is probably impossible to answer in some degree, so it's just about an opinion, really.
Okay. So first off, everybody approaches this differently.
Mm,
I tend to say we're deceiving ourselves if we use the word if, like you just did, if this continues. The stuff in the atmosphere it's its job in life. That's why it's built, in my opinion. The CO2 is very, very good at trapping infrared. So we are going to experience a steadily worsening climate, I'm afraid.
yeah.
And what we're going to have then is in the UK, let's do the UK, we're going to have heat waves, which already the heat wave from 2 years ago, it killed 42%. Well, the death rate on the July 19th and 20th of the extreme heat wave 2 years ago, the UK death rate spiked 42% compared to what it usually is on those days of the year. So we all know that for winter, you get a higher death rate. For summer, you get a lower death rate. You know what the average will be. Just 2 days of heat wave sadly, killed various people. Obviously, they will have been the more vulnerable people. Heat waves. So part one step there is let's look out for our neighbours. And let's also not poo-poo heat wave warnings.
Yeah.
Like many people, it's just summer. They say, yeah, but honestly, there were people. My friend's a heat wave researcher, and she's listened to some of the 999 calls from a Reading area.
Right.
The old lady on the phone said, "I just don't feel right. I don't know what it is. I just don't feel right." Sorry for the accent. But they downgraded that. They said it's not too serious. By the time they responded, the poor lady was dead
Mm,
because we're not used to it.
mm,
So what I'm appealing for here is let's wake up to what is normal, what's becoming normal,
yeah.
and make the most of helping each other out in this situation.
Yeah.
So heat is one. There's others, obviously, which is intense rainfall mainly. The other tendency, trend,
Mm,
is towards amazing amounts of cheap electricity from renewable energy. And this is the good news story.
mm,
It's almost like we have two graphs going on. There's the graph of how bad the temperature is getting, which is going upwards at a slightly accelerating rate at the moment. And then there's another graph, which is the graph of how many solar panels are being built and deployed. And China installed more last year than the whole of the world has ever installed in previous years.
yeah, I heard
So
that.
this is it's an incredibly fast deployment of what's actually very cheap electrical power. There are points, if you get on the right tariff, let's say of Octopus Energy, or there are probably others, which will give you a variable tariff depending on when it's windy and when it isn't. You can actually time your own usage in the UK to use very cheap electricity when it's windy or when it's very sunny. So these new it's like we call it the energy transition. It's an incredibly different landscape we're moving to, where at certain points of the day and the year, we'll have quite cheap electricity as we retire more and more of the very expensive gas. And well, we have basically got one coal plant left in the UK, which is just about to be closed. So that is a very encouraging situation.
Yeah.
Last year, I think solar panel prices dropped by 40%.
Right.
They won't drop 40% this year. It was just because they happened to have opened a whole load of solar panel factories in China at the same time. This year, they are suddenly opening a load of factories they've been building for a couple of years to build battery storage.
Right.
And so battery storage, including on a grid level, so you have them in a big sort of factory kind of building or a load of containers outside on an industrial estate or something, you can, the national grid is having more and more of these installed because it literally saves money to fill these batteries in the afternoon from solar power and then empty them onto the grid when everyone's turning their kettles on and cooking their tea in the evening. So the whole system is changing rapidly. It could do with a bit more of a push and help from government. It would change more rapidly. But there is hope here. Similarly, the price and capability of electric vehicles is coming down very fast.
Mm.
of course, these are big beasts and use a lot of minerals, but actually many of the mineral problems are being solved. People, you probably heard about cobalt as being a big problem for EV batteries. Actually, that was a problem from 5 years ago, and they've now produced EV batteries, mass produced them, which don't need much cobalt or any at all in some cases. So many of the problems are being solved. For the energy transition, you tend to hear publicity about what the big problems, but often that publicity is funded by oil companies, or at least embellished by oil companies, and is also out of date. So there are ways that it's less, but the new technology is less bad than they're portrayed. They still have problems, but the overall direction is that we could move to a high renewable economy. We are actually moving globally to a high renewable economy at an incredible pace.
Yeah.
I wish it was faster.
Mm.
At the COP, they agreed, one of their headlines was, we will triple renewable energy capacity. Actually, if you look at the graph of deployment, they would have hit that anyway. So hopefully by 2030, we'll blow that out of the water, because at this point of adaptation, where the prices have come down so much, there's very rapid deployment of the new technology. The analog there would be something like when everybody suddenly moved to smartphones. Okay, suddenly the technology was cheap, it was available, and it definitely improved people's lives. There's a lot of that going on. If you want more details on that, look up the name Tony Seba, S-E-B-A, Tony Seba. He's an analyst who has some amazing stuff on that.
Great stuff. Fantastic. Yeah, there's been so much we've covered.
I would say this: if you yourselves have made the various changes that are available to you, but then great. See what you can do to influence your friends. Obviously, people don't like being told what to do, but many are in a situation where a bit of advice from somebody who's done it, or who has experience of it, that can help. It's called your not your climate footprint, but your climate shadow. It's the people you're able to influence, or the organization you're able to influence. As artists, you often have more influence than many of us actually. I recognize the limits of climate communication. There a lot of people we don't make sense to, but artists and people with any experience of moving from the old to the new, and it is from sunset to sunrise. There is a possibility still of a better future available to us, where we're killing fewer animals, where we are digging less stuff out of the ground and shipping it around the world, where the air is cleaner, where if we do it right, there is cheaper energy for poorer households and all that sort of thing. It's often about how you do it. Although the climate picture is very, very sobering, I think so many of the ways through this give benefits in other ways, like I've just listed. But that is a good motivator for moving forwards and making the steps we can make. And if you're wondering about making a step, let's say you have the possibility of a heat pump or something, don't wait 2 more years. Start the research, get it done this summer. You will have lowered your footprint probably the biggest way you can, if that is your situation.
Yeah. Great. I just wanted to open it up if anybody in the group has anything they want to ask. Now is the time.
Just wanted to say thank you very much. It's really interesting. Made loads of notes, and have tried to do quite a lot of the things. But for example, the heat pump business, I live in a flat, and I would have to get everybody in this block of buildings to agree to change. But I have heard of groups that are working on on social housing blocks to look at doing it. And if somebody comes up with a good model, because I don't understand, couldn't the whole block have one huge heat pump? Or
do you have your own gas boiler, or do you have a central system that's going through all your?
No, everybody has their own boilers at the moment.
Okay, so
but the idea, the size of the pump, it would mean that we'd have to build like the thing on the outside of the building to stack if everybody has to have their own pump. But these are the kind of things that, I mean,
there are people
it's
working on this.
exactly.
There's
So
there's a
this is
group in
really
Glasgow I'm talking
interesting.
to tomorrow who are working on this for Glasgow tenements. Yes. Yes. But
What's it called?
it's not simple. It needs a bit of work as to how you fit it in to a balcony, or you wall mount it, or whatever you do. And then you need a way to store the energy, because it doesn't give you instant hot water. And so they have these devices that are about the size of a fridge, a small, an under counter fridge that can store like a whole day's worth of hot water, called a sun amp. It's a clever technology built in Scotland. So there are people who are working on this. It wouldn't do you any harm to write to your landlord organization. Is it the council, or is it a housing association?
No, that's not me, but mine is a private block. But I know of people who are working with groups to try and solve this. But I just wanted to say thank you so much. And I think this whole thing about the issues, and I think talking about the issues with other people and using our art in ways to get this message across is is something. And the whole thing about the injustice bit, really, everybody feels like their life is going to change, but I mean, we are still the privileged here. So anyway, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you from me too, Anne. This is just that you gave me such positives as well. And yes, we as artists, the injustice is the bit, the pain is the bit that we have to work on and take forward. And on a private note, I'm looking for an electric car. that will be the next. But they're so expensive in the end.
I'm going to give you a recommendation.
Okay.
Ecocars.net, I think it is. Eco-cars, because they seem to be very good at getting good prices on second-hand cars. You say what you want, or discuss what you want, and they seem to be able to get incredible prices. My friend did one that way, and I think he spent 9,000, so still a lot, but it was only a 3-year-old car.
Yeah, that's good.
And that was an Ionic, a Hyundai Ionic.
Okay. Thank you for that. Really helpful.
It might be just what you want, or might not be.
No, thanks a lot.
Great stuff. Okay, well, listen, we're going to close the call. Thank you so much. This has given us so much, and I think all of us are probably going to watch the recording once or twice because there's been the amount of information.
Fast. I'm sorry about that. I do.
No. But this is like exactly what we wanted. So it's another thing getting this information from someone like you. And so listen, all the best, and have a great year. And who knows? Maybe we'll ask you again in a year if you're free. But
yeah, well, you can definitely ask. You're welcome to answer. All the very best to you, and I
thank you so much.
Thank you.